Joining us now is Liz Cheney, former Wyoming Republican Congresswoman, former member of the House Republican leadership, and someone who might easily still hold both titles tonight, except that she stood up for democracy in the wake of January 6, up to and including in her role as vice chair of the January 6 committee, which set her apart from the former president, of course, who's running again, and most of her fellow Republicans who all but cast her out. Her new blockbuster book out today is Oath and Honor, a memoir and a warning. The final words in that title, a warning, certainly speak to the moment. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
This is not only a fascinating, terrifying book and a warning, as you say, it is also a really well-written, captivating story that just takes you from the first pages and it gallops you through the last many years of the descent of our democracy. Did you write a lot about Mike Johnson in the book? Obviously, when you were writing this, he wasn't the speaker. You didn't know he was going to be the speaker. Talk a little bit about, first of all, this idea that he wants to blur the faces. What does that tell you?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, with respect to the videotape, the Department of Justice already has these tapes. And I think that we're experiencing a situation where the Speaker Johnson, is somehow attempting to suggest that there is something in these tapes that would change the facts of what happened. There's nothing in the tapes that can change the facts of what happened that day, can change the violent assault. And you know, I have called on him to release the tapes. We need to make sure, obviously, that we protected security issues at the Capitol. But at this point, what's happening, I don't know why he's dragging his feet after having proclaimed he's going to release them, and he ought to release them.
Well, also this idea of blurring the faces, as you said, the tapes are already, law enforcement already has. I mean, it seems like it's kabuki theater to January 6 defendants and their supporters and others that he's standing up to protect them, when in fact it actually has no purpose.
Yeah, and it's a perfect example of the lengths to which he will go, even in his rhetoric. I mean, he actually said to protect people from the Department of Justice, and at the same time he proclaims that, you know, he is representing the, quote, rule of law party. So it's I think the game's ought to stop, and if he's going to release tapes, you ought to just go ahead and release
You know,
tapes.
he portrays himself, he's not well known on the world stage. He certainly portrays himself as this certainly very devout and very earnest and you know, thoughtful person. That is not, he seems like a slippery character in the pages of your book. I mean, the reality of him behind the scenes is very different.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't question anybody's faith, but I, you know, knew him well. We were friends. We were elected the same time. I believed him to be somebody who was honorable. But then, sadly, I watched through the whole process, first of the amicus brief that he pushed members of the House to sign on, which, you know, was constitutionally infirm, and the Supreme Court.
Right. Let's talk about that. I mean, he sent out a letter to members of Congress, essentially saying, you know, do this for President Trump.
Right.
And the arguments he was making, according to you, were, I mean, they weren't sound legally.
Yeah, and he was claiming and telling members that the brief itself was just simply an effort to convince the courts to hear this case, when in fact the brief itself made serious charges, alleged you know, activity that was unconstitutional, alleged that people in the states had conducted themselves in ways that were unconstitutional, and made these allegations even though courts across the country in each of these states had already heard these facts, had already determined that what the brief was asserting was not true. And I also think there are serious ethical problems. Somebody who's a member of the bar asserting in front of the court facts known to them about which they don't have any basis.
He was also saying that he was a constitutional scholar and that there was an implied threat in his brief.
Yeah, and I heard from a number of our colleagues who said, wait a minute, you know, he's taking down names and making a list for Donald Trump to look at. Is this in fact a threat? He denied that it was, but the activity continued into the objections over the electoral votes as well. And I wasn't the only one who was raising a red flag about his activities. Kevin McCarthy's own senior counsel was doing the same thing. And she, in fact, said that she had talked to him and he knew that what he was doing didn't have any basis in the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, you write, Mike Johnson and our Republican leaders have played a destructive role. The amicus brief episode revealed a side of Mike I had not seen before. He appeared especially susceptible to flattery from Trump and aspired to being anywhere in Trump's orbit. He was telling our colleagues he was a constitutional law expert while advocating positions that were constitutionally infirm. Do you believe he poses a threat to the integrity of the 2024 presidential election?
I do think that if we come to a place where he's the Speaker of the House, where the Republicans are in the majority on January 6th of 2025, there are real questions about whether or not that majority will do what's required under the Constitution. For example, if an election would be thrown into the House, or even going through the process of counting electoral votes.
An election could end up going to the House, where the House would determine. You think the Republicans in the House are not responsible enough to do what is right and what is legal?
Yeah, I mean, I think the lesson that we've seen over the course of the last couple of years is that this group of elected Republicans can't be counted on to defend the Constitution. And that's a very sad thing for me to say. It's a very dangerous place for the country to be, but that's what we've seen based on the actions of the last several years.
I mean, what will get this fever dream among these Republicans to stop and to go back to being a party that wants to actually govern and get stuff done and be part of the fabric of democracy?
I think we have to have the majority of the American people who are not part of sort of the cult of personality around Donald Trump. There is a portion of the party that absolutely is not going to be convinced to move away from him, but it's a much smaller number than the vast majority of Republicans, Democrats, and independents combined. And those of us who understand the danger have to be committed to working across party lines to protect against it.
Kevin McCarthy, the details that you have about Kevin McCarthy in this book, we reported last week that McCarthy told you that his trip down to Mar-a-Lago, where he went to kiss the ring, was that Trump was depressed and not eating. The former president has responded the other day saying actually that he was angry and eating too much. You don't buy either of those explanations.
I mean, I certainly didn't buy Kevin's explanation. Trump's, maybe that's the first truth he's ever spoken. I don't know. But the bottom line is what he was really doing was when big donors cut off donations to the Republicans after the insurrection, he needed money. And the only place he could get money was to go see Trump and get access to his list of donors. But of course, that meant going down there and helping him to begin to sort of wipe away the stain of what he'd done.
Why do you think so many Lindsey Graham, who, said he was done with Trump, he's out that night, and then I remember somebody yelled at him in the airport, I think on his way back down to South Carolina, and then all of a sudden he's playing golf with the former president.
Yeah, I don't understand it. I mean, I think there's a lot of years are going to be spent on sort of psychoanalysis of a number of members of my party. And I think that the danger that we face, though, is that people are now willing to sort of accept these really extreme things that Donald Trump is claiming he'll do. We're not guessing about what he'll do.
Do they actually believe these lies, do you think?
No, I think the number of people who believe the lies in elected office is very small. I think in the House Republicans, it's probably single digits. But you have obviously a far larger group of people, some who have determined that they're going to be fully on board and aggressively supporting and enabling Trump, and a lot of others who've said we're going to look the other way. And that's really dangerous, because then people around the country sort of start to say, well, it must not be that bad if you don't have that many Republicans speaking out against it. And it's...
Your dad called you just before the joint session of Congress on January 6th. He'd been listening to Trump's speech at the Ellipse. What did he say to you?
He called me. I was in the cloakroom off the House floor working on remarks I was going to give, and he called me and he asked me if I was watching the speech, and I said I wasn't because of my working on the remarks, and he told me that Trump had said we have to get rid of the Liz Cheneys of the world, and he said to me, you're in danger. And he said we need to talk about whether or not, given that he's just done this, that he's just targeted you specifically, what that means for you going onto the House floor, what that means for you in terms of speaking against the objections. Through the course of our conversation, it was clear we both knew I couldn't not proceed because of this threat from Donald Trump. But that's you can imagine sort of the emotion of the moment to have my dad calling me to say the president has just, targeted me in a way that put me at risk.
Do you understand a Bill Barr who has, was very loyal to the president while he was in office, and then, clearly has had a change of heart, and yet not saying categorically that he would not vote for the former president?
I guess I have a couple of views about that. I think there are a number of people, including Bill Barr, who were around the president, who stopped the president from doing far worse. Bill Barr certainly is one of the people who told the president repeatedly that what he was saying was untrue about fraud in the election and said it publicly. But I don't think that you can acknowledge and recognize the facts and the mountain of evidence that points to what Donald Trump did, to his direct involvement in attempting to seize power and overturn an election, and then turn around and say that you would vote for him again. I think people really do have to come to grips with the fact that those are inconsistent. And when you say that you will vote for him despite what he's already done, you're helping to make sure that he continues as a force in the politics of this nation, and that's dangerous.